Welcome to the House settlement era, everybody. July 1st, we've been waiting on this for months, if not years now, for the House settlement to come into effect. Now, some of you have asked, well, Jake, what is the House settlement? Because I've talked about it on and off on this podcast and how it's going to affect BYU and how it's going to affect the Big 12 and college football as a whole. What it is, just in a nutshell, it is a settlement of 3 antitrust cases that were levied against the NCAA, and it settles those by giving back pay of up to $2.8 billion to eligible Division I athletes who competed between 2016 and 2024 and were denied the opportunity to make NIL during their playing careers at whatever university and in whatever sport. Now, the payouts for those will range depending on what your status was as an athlete, what sport you played, and the like. But more importantly, in this day and age for college football, it changes everything. Many of you know that there is going to be a revenue share today that officially goes into effect. For the first time ever, schools, BYU among them, are now eligible and able legally to pay their athletes. There is a cap of $20.5 million that you can share with your athletes. And the expectation is that at least 70, if not 80 or more percent of that revenue share money will be going to the football programs. You break it down this way, the BYU, they are going to have 100-ish guys on their roster. The other thing about this is it installs no longer scholarship limits, but just simply roster limits. You can fully fund as many scholarships as you want across any sport, but you obviously have to do that as an individual university. Football is having a cut down over time because they've grandfathered in any player who is beyond what they have installed as a 105-man roster limit for FBS Division I football. But BYU's players, whether they have 105, 110, 115, or 123, which was the old number, that was the max player number of players you could have, BYU now has contracts that are now enforceable with their athletes that guarantee them a set amount of money. Now, I don't know, I'm not privy to the information as to how much money is going each which way to which player on BYU's roster, but I understand from what I've heard from people inside the BYU football program, and BYU's not alone in this, is that the way they're approaching this House settlement era is that whether they have, let's say you have $20 million and you pay 80% of it to the football program, that's, let's say, easy math, $16 million. That's what you have to delineate across your entire football roster. Well, as you all know, with the NFL, some positions are worth more than others. Quarterbacks, obviously, worth more. Left tackles, worth more. Defensive ends, star linebackers. There are priority positions. There's other positions that don't take as much priority and therefore don't make as much money. BYU has had negotiations via Dave George, who's their new GM, and the players. They have sat down, they've hammered out an agreement, and today, for the first time ever, it is enforceable, and BYU players will be getting payments via this revenue share that comes directly from Brigham Young University to themselves. Previously, they got scholarship checks, they got Alston money, they were getting NIL checks, they were getting money from the collectives and the like, but now BYU is officially in the business of paying its own athletes, and they are one of just hundreds of football programs across the country. There will also be between 15 and 20% going to Division I men's basketball programs. So there will be a smaller amount of money going to BYU basketball. But the other thing about BYU basketball is that Kevin Young and the NIL prowess that BYU brought to bear with this past recruiting cycle, I don't think they're going to have to spend as much money as they probably planned on. And they may be able to bank some of this money away for next year's recruiting class. And maybe that could entice a few guys to come BYU's way if they can get a little extra cheddar, as it were, via that revenue share. Now, that remains to be determined. We'll see what happens in the upcoming recruiting cycle for men's basketball. But really, the rest of the athletes at BYU and other universities, there's going to be between 5 and 10% of that money, speaking of the revenue share, that's going to go to the rest of the athletes. Some schools will prioritize a different sport that maybe makes revenue, because revenue means that you bring money into the university. And really, the two that make the most money and really make the only money at most universities, and BYU's right among them, are football and men's basketball. Now, could you find a one-off, like maybe BYU women's soccer is close to being a revenue generator? Well, that would necessitate maybe some extra money going their way, but it's a small part of the pie that goes to those other athletes, but there will be some money going their way as well. Other things that go into effect today include the new enforcement entity. It's called the College Sports Commission. Now, it's essentially supposed to replace the NCAA and be able to enforce the rules of the House settlement era. Do I believe it's actually going to enforce those? And do I believe that they are truly enforceable? I've got my questions about that, because let's be honest. This is a sport, speaking of college football in particular, that has been rife with grifting, with cheating, with money being spent under the table to entice athletes to go to various universities, literally since the early days of this sport that goes back over 150 years. It has been part of the fabric of college football. Do I really believe that it's going to be all above board with everybody? No, I do not. But this College Sports Commission is supposed to have an enforcement arm that is capable of punishing schools to keep them in line. We'll see if it's able to pull that off. The other thing is now that they also have NIL deals. Anything over $600, and don't ask me why it is a $600 threshold. Any NIL deal that's worth that or more now has to go through a clearinghouse run by Deloitte Consulting, which is called NIL Go. So, for example, many of you know that on this podcast, I have had football players be a special guest. I have paid them for their appearances. Connor Pay the last 2 years, Clark Barrington before that, and we're currently looking at all options in terms of next year. Well, I can tell you this much. With all the appearances that Connor Pay made this past year, his NIL deal was well over $600 and would have been vetted by this Deloitte Consulting. Now, as I understand it, they say that most true NIL deals, they said 80 or 90% of those would be approved under the current parameters that Deloitte Consulting plans on working with. They say that somewhere between 80 and 90% of old revenue deals, or whatever you term the collective deals that athletes were signing before this, those would have been nixed under this new consulting arm that's going to run things. Yesterday, Open Doors, which is one of the chief platforms for NIL money to be transferred to athletes via collectives and the like, said they set a single day record for their company with $20 million being spread around to athletes. What that means is literally up until midnight on June 30th, right before July 1 hits, there were deals being signed that include potentially multi-million-dollar deals that are going to be paid out to these athletes because they are not subject to NIL Go unless they were agreed to beginning today. I can imagine that there are BYU athletes that are very happy to have the deals that they have. And now that they're not subject to that NIL Go, they can collect that check and move forward. But this new era, it's going to necessitate that you have to be much more on the up and up in terms of checking all the boxes when it comes to true NIL. And BYU fully intends to comply with this. We all know that BYU, they are rule followers, and for good reason. That's just the way that BYU operates. You may want to argue with it and say, hey, you should break the rules a little bit, BYU. That's not BYU style. We all know that. We just saw that with Jake Retzloff. They upheld their standard with regards to the honor code. We have seen for years accusations of other universities that competed with BYU in the recruiting sphere before NIL was a thing and above board, that bagmen and the like existed in the sport and maybe siphoned off some talent that BYU would have liked to have had otherwise. Well, with these new rules, expect BYU to play by said rules, and they're going to have to hope to high heavens that everybody else plays by those rules. The good news is the athletes win in this. $20.5 million is an incredible amount of money. I can think of walk-ons with the BYU football program. One guy that I absolutely love his story just because I think it's incredible that where he's come from. Tanner Wall. Tanner was a guy, remember, he came out of the Washington, D.C. area, was an all-conference player, really fine player in his high school days, but didn't, as I understand it, get a ton of recruiting attention, especially from his dream school, that being BYU. Well, he decided to walk on to BYU after his mission and start out as a wide receiver. Didn't see much action at all in Fesi Sitake's room. And then Ed Lamb, crazily enough, when he was coaching BYU safety, said, hey, Tanner, flip over to defense. Let's see what you got. And from there, Tanner's had a meteoric rise. But at no point, as far as I'm aware, Tanner has ever been on scholarship. He has been paying his own way. Now, he has probably likely got some NIL money that has been able to help defray the costs of paying for school and training. And I know that he's married and the like, but it's not an easy life as a walk-on to be doing what Tanner Wall has done. But he has turned himself into what I think is a potential all-conference player coming up this upcoming season. Tanner is that good of a football player. And to have a contract now in effect that could pay him, let's say, potentially $100,000 or hundreds of thousands of dollars, that's life-changing money for a guy like that. Now, there are other guys in the BYU football program who already had NIL deals. They're paying them that or more money. But I think that walk-ons in particular are going to benefit from this to a larger level than I think any of us might realize. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I just look at like a story of a Tanner Wall where he made a position switch and has emerged as a starting caliber Big 12 safety that I think is poised to have a monster senior season, man, to have this type of money coming his way, what do you think he could do with that had he had this for 3 or 4 years? Who knows? But I really do like the fact that the athletes, they do win in this because it's more money coming their way because let's be honest, this is a multi-billion dollar business that's been built literally on their backs. All right, that is going to do it for today's edition of the podcast. And once again, welcome to the House Era. It's a crazy new world out there. And hey, we'll see what happens as we move forward into this new era. But as always, thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen today. And once again, as always, thank you for being an everydayer right here on the Locked On Cougars podcast.